In the period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, the United States Congress enacted a series of laws that gave blacks the rights of citizenship, voting, and equal protection under the law. But when blacks tried to claim those rights, Southern whites tried to deny them. In the late 1860s, white supremacist groups began to organize throughout the South. The largest was the Ku Klux Klan.
The origins of the KKK are a little bit obscure. It seems to have begun in Tennessee. It certainly began among former Confederate soldiers. Initially, it seemed to be given over to pranksterism. But very quickly, the KKK becomes a rubric to describe all sorts of paramilitary and vigilante groups, some small, some large, some politically connected, some relatively ad hoc, that take it as their task to enforce the submission of the now free black population through violent means.
The Klan's presence was especially strong in Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where blacks equaled or outnumbered the white population. The Klan was made up of former Confederate soldiers, some members of the Democratic Party, and those resistant to Congress's plans to reconstruct the South. They were angry that the Republican Party, who held the majority in Congress and were the ones pushing for civil rights for blacks, were forcing these changes by controlling Southern state governments against the will of white residents there. Klan members terrorized blacks in church, at the polls, and in schools. They intimidated teachers, forcing them to stop teaching black students. They used threats of violence to keep blacks from leaving plantations. And then the threats became real. They beat, tortured, and even murdered blacks to prevent them from voting and from serving as political leaders. Between 1865 and 1877, the Klan and other related white supremacist groups were responsible for more than 4,000 deaths throughout the South.
You might say it's really the first period of homegrown American terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan was the Al-Qaeda of the 19th century.
These acts of terrorism were effective. Many blacks stayed home from the polls out of fear. As blacks overwhelmingly voted for Republicans, Republican-controlled state governments in the South began to weaken.
And this was the beginning of a process that eventually leads to a much more massive white mobilization of vigilante violence, which toppled Reconstruction governments through violent means in the middle of the 1870s.
In response to the murders and intimidation, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a law that directed the federal government to prosecute people who attempted to deny blacks their civil rights. Still, the Klan and other groups continued to grow over the next century.
A Halloween costume that is a family tradition is creating a stir in the town of Craigsville.
My brother has when he was in kindergarten and when he was 13.
That's why when Jessica Black's 7-year-old son asked if he could also dress as a member of the white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan, she made the costume for him.
Because it was cool.
What was cool about it?
The hat part.
I did tell him that, if you do it, there's going to be people talking about you. There's going to be people that say bad things to you when you do wear it.
Neighbors say this is one of several streets, Brook Hollow Road, that Jackson was seen trick-or-treating. They say they were shocked when they saw his costume.
I just think it's really sad, that a kid is being taught that young, because they don't know any better. You don't hear that much about it nowadays.
When I asked Jackson Black where he had learned of the costume, he said he saw it in the movie Fried Green Tomatoes. His mom maintains there is nothing wrong with the costume or the Ku Klux Klan, which she says still exists in Craigsville.
It's supposed to be white with white, black with black, man and with woman, and all of that. That's what the KKK stands for. The KKK every year raises money to donate to the St. Jude's.
Will you still wear the costume?
Yes. It's not okay. You're offending a lot of people by one little action.
Jessica Black says she has received several threats via Facebook because of this photo of Jackson that was posted on our Facebook page.
After Northern troops left the South in 1877, African Americans found themselves in near slavery conditions once again. Without land of their own, they were often reduced to sharecropping, working the land of their former masters in exchange for a share of the year's harvest.
Former slave owners couldn't imagine the idea of bargaining on any kind of basis with former slaves, and they believed that the only way they could continue to grow cotton was to force African Americans to work. They had to find some kind of coercive mechanism.
The sharecropping system basically allowed farm workers to trade their labor for crops.
African American workers, they don't have tools, they can't supply themselves with seed and other equipment. This is supplied by the landowner. And rather than being paid cash, they are paid a share of the crop.
It was the economic structure of sharecropping that allowed near-slavery conditions to continue on plantations.
Each year you borrow money, and at the end of the year, often you can't pay it back because the price of cotton is falling and what you get for your crop is not enough to actually pay off your debts. So instead of getting out of debt, they're falling further and further into debt each year.
The only way for sharecroppers to pay back their debt was by providing another season of labor to the landowner. They were stuck in place.
What it meant was that African American laborers were tied down to certain geographical areas, and therefore they found it very hard to use their shares of the crop or other wages they might get to accumulate any resources and eventually purchase their own land.
The system of sharecropping finally ended with the industrial boom of the Second World War. Large numbers of African Americans left the South for factory jobs in the North, leaving behind the farms they had toiled on for generations.
Buried in old courthouses, abandoned jails, libraries, and archives all across the South are tens of thousands of public documents and letters written by African Americans at the turn of the last century.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree and they's been working him in prison for 12 months. He's done nothing wrong for them to keep him in chains.
Written more than 40 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, these letters bear witness to a sinister and little-known chapter in American history.
Whenever one is in a conversation where someone says, what's wrong with black people? Why can't they get over it? Slavery ended 150 years ago. That's fundamentally false. The reality is that slavery and all of the limitations that it imposed on the future and the potential and the progress of African American families, it didn't end 150 years ago. It continued until World War II, well into the lives of large numbers of African Americans today.
For more than 80 years following the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South were pulled back into the shadow of slavery.
Buying and selling African Americans ended with the 13th Amendment, but that did not translate into actual freedom.
One of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime.
With emancipation, the nature of both crime and punishment in the South changed dramatically. In state after state, county after county, laws were passed to criminalize black life.
It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark. But the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statute. In every southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
Once arrested, convicts were released and forced to labor in coal mines, lumber camps, brick factories, and turpentine farms. They were shackled, imprisoned, and tortured, sometimes to the point of death.
The fact that blacks were treated the way they were, like animals. People could be just picked up and put in jail. They could be lost in the system. Nobody knew how to find them. They could be buried in some grave somewhere and families still looking for them. Don't know where they are. I didn't know that the sheriff department could sell slaves to corporations, steel plants, and coal mines.
The constant threat of arrest and forced labor, like the threat of lynching, cast a shadow over the South. Slavery had ended, but true freedom had not begun.